The lie slipped out of Ethan's mouth before he could stop it, a reckless spark in the heat of desperation. At 17, he'd do anything to escape the suffocating weight of his small-town life in rural Ohio, especially for a chance at skate camp, the exclusive summer program in upstate New York where the best skateboarders trained. But when the camp's organizer, a gruff former pro named Hank, mentioned it was an LGBTQ plus safe space, Ethan blurted, "I'm gay," without a second thought. It was a lie born of necessity. Skate camp was his ticket out, a chance to shred with legends and prove he was more than the kid stuck in a nowhere town, mowing lawns for gas money. Ethan wasn't gay. At least, he didn't think so. Girls had always been his thing, or so he told himself, picturing the cheerleaders he'd flirted with at school. But the lie was his golden pass, and he wasn't about to let a little moral hiccup stop him. He packed his board, his worn-out Vans, and a backpack full of guilt, and headed to the camp that would change everything. The first day at skate camp was a whirlwind of color and chaos. The lakefront campus buzzed with skaters from across the country, their boards clattering against ramps under the late June sun. Ethan felt like he'd stepped into a dream until he met Caleb. Caleb was everything Ethan wasn't. Confident, unapologetic, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through people. He was the camp's unofficial leader, a 19-year-old phenom who could land a 720 like it was nothing. And he was openly gay, wearing it like a badge of honor. When Caleb caught Ethan staring during a kickflip demo, he grinned and skated over. "You're the new guy, right?" "Ethan." Caleb's voice was warm, teasing. "Heard you're from Ohio. What's that like?" Ethan fumbled, his lie burning in his throat. "Oh, it's flat. Not much to do." He forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. Caleb's gaze lingered, curious, and Ethan felt a strange jolt, something he couldn't name but didn't dislike. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into skating to avoid scrutiny. He nailed tricks he'd only dreamed of, fueled by the camp's electric energy. But Caleb was always there, offering tips, cracking jokes, or just watching him with that disarming smile. Ethan told himself it was just friendship, nothing more. He wasn't that guy. He couldn't be. Yet every time Caleb's hand brushed his while passing a water bottle or their shoulders bumped during a late-night bonfire, Ethan's pulse raced in a way that felt dangerous. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, the campers gathered around a fire pit by the lake. Caleb sat next to Ethan, their knees touching. The group was sharing stories, some funny, some raw, about coming out, facing rejection, finding themselves. Ethan stayed quiet, his lie a heavy stone in his chest. When it was his turn, he mumbled something vague about figuring things out and prayed no one pressed him. Caleb didn't push, but his eyes held a question Ethan wasn't ready to answer. "You don't talk much about yourself," Caleb said later, as they walked back to the cabins. The gravel crunched under their sneakers, the only sound in the still night. Ethan shrugged, staring at the ground. "Not much to say." Caleb stopped, turned to face him. "I don't buy that. Everyone's got a story." His voice was soft but firm, like he could see the truth Ethan was hiding, even from himself. The next day, during a double skate session, Ethan and Caleb were paired for a trick combo. Their boards moved in sync, a rhythm that felt effortless. When Ethan stumbled on a landing, Caleb caught his arm, steadying him. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the world fell away. Ethan's heart pounded, not from the fall, but from the warmth of Caleb's hand, the intensity in his gaze. He pulled away, muttering an excuse, and skated off, his mind a storm of confusion. That night, alone in his bunk, Ethan couldn't sleep. He replayed every moment with Caleb, the laughs, the glances, the touches that lingered too long. He told himself it was nothing, that he was just caught up in the camp's vibe. But deep down, a truth was stirring, one he'd buried under years of small-town expectations and his own stubborn denial. The lie he'd told to get here was starting to feel less like a lie, and that terrified him. By the end of the first week, Ethan was unraveling. He was skating better than ever, but his thoughts were a mess. Caleb's presence was a magnet, pulling him towards something he wasn't ready to face. When Caleb invited him to a late-night skate session by the lake, just the two of them, Ethan knew he couldn't say no. The moon lit the ramps, casting long shadows as they took turns landing tricks. Caleb's laughter echoed, and Ethan felt a pull he couldn't ignore. "Yo, you're killing it out here," Caleb said, rolling to a stop. He was close now, too close, his breath visible in the cool night air. "Why do I feel like you're holding back, though? Not just with skating." Ethan's mouth went dry. "I'm not holding back," he lied, but his voice cracked. Caleb stepped closer, his eyes searching. "You sure about that?" The air between them crackled, and Ethan's world tilted. He wanted to run, to hide, to cling to the version of himself he'd always known. But Caleb's gaze held him, steady and unafraid. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if the lie he'd told wasn't a lie at all. The late-night skate session left Ethan reeling. Caleb's question hung in the air, unanswered, as they parted ways under the moonlight. Ethan's bunk felt like a cage, the walls closing in as he wrestled with thoughts he'd never dared to entertain. He wasn't gay. He couldn't be. Back in Ohio, he'd grown up hearing whispers about those people, the kind of talk that made it clear being anything but straight wasn't an option. Yet Caleb's presence was a crack in that armor, letting in feelings Ethan didn't know how to name. The second week of camp brought new challenges. The campers were tasked with designing a group skate performance for the final showcase, a chance to impress scouts for pro circuits. Ethan and Caleb were grouped together, their chemistry on the ramps undeniable. They spent hours choreographing, their boards weaving patterns that felt like a dance. But every brush of Caleb's hand, every shared laugh, pushed Ethan closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. One afternoon, during a break by the lake, Caleb opened up. They were sprawled on the grass, boards tossed aside, the sun warming their faces. "I came out when I was 15, Caleb said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "My dad didn't take it well. Kicked me out for a month. I stayed with a friend, kept skating to stay sane. This camp, it's my home now." Ethan listened, his heart twisting. He wanted to share something real, to match Caleb's honesty, but the lie he'd told to get here choked him. "That's rough," he managed, hating how hollow it sounded. Caleb just nodded, his eyes soft, like he knew Ethan was hiding something. The tension built as the days passed. Ethan's skating was sharper, fueled by the storm inside him. He landed tricks he'd never dared try, as if pushing his body could silence his mind. But Caleb was always there, a steady presence that both grounded and unsettled him. During a late practice, Caleb suggested they add a risky move to their routine, a synchronized 540 that required perfect timing. "You trust me?" Caleb asked, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Ethan hesitated, his pulse racing. "Yeah," he said finally, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. They practiced until midnight, their boards carving arcs under the floodlights. When they finally nailed it, Caleb hooped and grabbed Ethan in a hug. The embrace lingered, Caleb's warmth seeping into him, and Ethan didn't pull away. For a moment, he let himself feel it, the spark, the pull, the truth he'd been running from. But the next day, reality crashed in. During a group discussion about identity, another camper, a sharp-tongued kid named Riley, called Ethan out. "You don't talk like the rest of us," Riley said, eyes narrowed. "What's your deal? You don't seem you know." The accusation hung in the air, and Ethan's stomach dropped. He mumbled something about being private, but Riley's smirk told him the suspicion wasn't gone. Caleb stepped in, deflecting with a joke, but the damage was done. Ethan felt exposed, his lie a ticking bomb. That night, he avoided the bonfire, hiding in his cabin with his thoughts. What if they found out? Would they kick him out? Would Caleb hate him? The idea of losing Caleb's respect, or whatever was growing between them, hurt more than he expected. The next morning, Ethan threw himself into skating to drown out the noise in his head. He pushed too hard, attempting a trick he wasn't ready for, and wiped out hard on the half-pipe. Pain shot through his ankle, and he crumpled, cursing. Caleb was there in an instant, kneeling beside him. "You okay?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "I'm fine," Ethan snapped, but his eyes stung. Caleb helped him up, his touch gentle but firm, and Ethan couldn't meet his gaze. They sat on the sidelines, Caleb's hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything," Caleb said quietly. "Not to me, not to anyone." Ethan wanted to confess right then, to admit the lie, to spill everything. But fear stopped him. Instead, he nodded, his throat tight, and let Caleb's words sink in. They spent the rest of the day together, not skating, but talking about music, dreams, the future. Ethan felt the walls he'd built start to crumble, but he wasn't ready to let them fall. As the week ended, the showcase loomed, and Ethan's ankle was still sore. Caleb insisted they modify their routine to keep him safe, but Ethan refused. "I can do it," he said, his voice fierce. He wasn't just talking about the trick. Caleb looked at him, a mix of pride and something deeper in his eyes, and nodded. The night before the showcase, they sat by the lake again, the water reflecting the stars. Caleb reached for Ethan's hand, his fingers tentative. "Whatever's going on with you," he said softly, "you don't have to face it alone." Ethan's heart pounded, and for the first time he didn't pull away. He squeezed Caleb's hand, the gesture small but seismic, and felt the lie he'd told start to blur into something real. The showcase was electric, the air thick with anticipation. Hundreds gathered around the outdoor skate park, scouts and campers alike buzzing with energy. Ethan's ankle throbbed, but he taped it tight, determined to prove himself, not just as a skater, but as someone worthy of Caleb's trust. The lie that had brought him here felt like a distant echo, drowned out by the truth stirring in his chest. As he and Caleb took the ramp, their synchronized moves drew cheers, their boards slicing through the air in perfect harmony. When they landed the 540, the crowd erupted, and Caleb's grin lit up the night. Ethan felt alive, untethered, like he could be anyone he wanted to be. But the high didn't last. After the showcase, Riley cornered Ethan in the equipment shed. "I looked you up," Riley said, his voice low and sharp. "Your high school's at a public forum. Some girl you dated posted about you. You're not gay, are you?" Ethan froze, his lie exposed like a raw nerve. Riley's smirk was cruel. "What's your game, man? You think you can fake your way in here?" Ethan's mind raced. He could deny it, double down, but the weight of the lie was crushing him. "It's not like that," he stammered, but Riley was already walking away, promising to tell the others. Panic surged through Ethan. If Hank found out, he'd be sent home. If Caleb found out, Ethan couldn't bear the thought. He found Caleb by the lake, skipping stones into the water. The words tumbled out before Ethan could stop them. "I lied," he said, his voice breaking. "I told Hank I was gay to get into camp. I'm not, or I didn't think I was. I don't know anymore." Tears burned his eyes as he braced for Caleb's anger. Caleb's face was unreadable for a moment, then softened. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, not accusing, just hurt. Ethan explained everything. The desperation to escape Ohio, the lie that fell harmless at the time, the confusion that had grown with every moment they spent together. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Ethan said. "I didn't know I'd feel this way." Caleb stepped closer, his voice steady. "Feel what?" Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to run, to hide, but Caleb's eyes held him. "I don't know," Ethan whispered. "But when I'm with you, I feel right." Caleb didn't speak. Instead, he closed the distance between them, his lips brushing Ethan's in a kiss that was soft, tentative, but electric. Ethan's world tilted, every doubt and fear melting under the warmth of Caleb's touch. When they pulled apart, Caleb's smile was small but real. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." The next day, Riley made good on his threat, spreading the word about Ethan's lie. Whispers followed him, and some campers avoided him, their trust shaken. Hank called Ethan into his office, his face stern. "You lied to get here," Hank said. "That's not what this place is about." Ethan nodded, shame burning his throat. He expected to be sent home, but Hank sighed. You've got talent, kid, and heart. Stay, but you owe this community honesty from now on. Ethan apologized to the group that night, his voice shaking as he admitted his lie. Some forgave him, others didn't. But Caleb stood by him, his presence a quiet strength. They spent the final days of camp inseparable, stealing moments by the lake, sharing quiet confessions under the stars. Ethan was still scared, still unsure, but with Caleb, he felt like he could face anything. As camp ended, Ethan returned to Ohio, his heart heavy with the distance between him and Caleb. They promised to stay in touch, texting late into the night, but real life was different. Back home, Ethan faced the same small-town judgment, the same expectations. He tried dating a girl from school, hoping to reclaim the version of himself he'd known, but it felt wrong, like wearing someone else's skin. Caleb's voice, his laugh, his touch, they haunted Ethan, a reminder of the truth he couldn't outrun. Months passed, and Ethan's texts with Caleb grew sporadic. Life pulled them apart, college applications, part-time jobs, the grind of reality. Ethan buried his feelings, telling himself it was just a phase, a summer fling born of confusion. But late at night, when the world was quiet, he'd replay that kiss by the lake, and his heart would ache for something he couldn't name. By spring, Ethan was drowning in doubt. He'd been accepted to a community college, but Ohio felt like a trap. One night, after a fight with his dad over his future, Ethan called Caleb. I don't know who I am anymore, he admitted, his voice raw. Caleb listened, then said, come to New York. Stay with me. Figure it out. Ethan didn't hesitate. He packed a bag, grabbed his board, and bought a bus ticket. As the miles rolled by, he felt the weight of his lie lift, replaced by a fragile hope. He wasn't sure what he'd find in New York, but he knew one thing. Caleb was waiting, and that was enough. New York City hit Ethan like a tidal wave. The noise, the crowds, the endless pulse of life. It was everything Ohio wasn't. Caleb met him at the bus station, his smile as bright as Ethan remembered. They hugged, and for a moment, the world felt right again. Caleb's apartment was a tiny walk-up in Brooklyn, cluttered with skateboards and vinyl records, but it felt like a sanctuary. Ethan crashed on the couch, his board propped against the wall, and for the first time in months, he breathed easy. Caleb was different here, more grounded, but still magnetic. He was working a skate shop, saving for college, and skating in local competitions. He introduced Ethan to his friends, a tight-knit crew of skaters and artists who welcomed him without question. But Ethan felt like an outsider, still grappling with who he was. At night, he and Caleb talked for hours, peeling back layers of themselves. Caleb shared stories of his struggles, family rejection, the fight to be himself. Ethan listened, his own truths spilling out in fragments. He told Caleb about Ohio, the pressure to be normal, the fear that kept him from admitting what he felt. One evening, they went to a skate park in Williamsburg, the city skyline glittering in the distance. They took turns on the ramps, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. After a perfect run, Caleb grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him close. You're different here, Caleb said, his voice soft. Freer. Ethan's heart raced. Because of you, he admitted, the words heavy with truth. They kissed, harder this time, the city fading around them. It wasn't just a moment. It was a choice. Ethan wasn't hiding anymore. But freedom came with a cost. Ethan's parent called, demanding he come home. This isn't you, his mom said, her voice sharp with worry. You're throwing your life away. Ethan tried to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't ready to tell them everything. Not yet. He hung up, his chest tight, and Caleb was there, wrapping him in a hug. You don't have to do this alone, Caleb said, echoing his words from camp. Ethan found a job at a coffee shop, scraping by as he figured out his next steps. He and Caleb grew closer, their relationship a fragile but growing thing. They skated together, cooked late-night meals, and fell asleep tangled in each other's arms. But doubt still lingered. Ethan wondered if he was enough, for Caleb, for himself, for the life he was trying to build. The lie he'd told at camp felt like a shadow, a reminder of the person he'd been. One night, at a local skate competition, Ethan saw a chance to prove himself. He entered, nervous but determined, with Caleb cheering from the sidelines. The crowd was huge, the energy electric. Ethan's run was flawless, each trick a defiance of his past. When he landed the final 720, the crowd roared, and Caleb rushed to him, their embrace of victory sweeter than any trophy. But as they celebrated, a familiar face appeared, Riley from camp. He was competing too, and his glare cut through Ethan like a blade. "You're still here," Riley said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Thought you'd run back to Ohio after your little scam." Ethan tensed, but Caleb stepped forward, his voice cold. "Back off, Riley. He's more real than you'll ever be." Riley laughed, but the words stung. Later, alone with Caleb, Ethan broke down. What if he's right? What if I'm just faking it, even now? Caleb took his face in his hands, his eyes fierce. "You're not faking this," he said. "What we have, what you're feeling, it's real. You're enough." Those words carried Ethan through the weeks that followed. He started opening up to Caleb's friends, sharing bits of his story. He even called his parents again, this time telling them he was staying in New York, that he was figuring out who he was. They didn't understand, but they didn't hang up, and that was a start. Ethan began to see a future, not just with Caleb, but for himself. As summer turned to fall, Ethan and Caleb took a trip back to the lake where skate camp was held. The ramps were empty, the air cool with the promise of autumn. They skated together, laughing like they had that first summer, but now there was no lie between them. Ethan felt whole, like the pieces of himself were finally fitting together. He wasn't just the kid who'd lied to get here. He was someone who'd found his truth, and it was more beautiful than he'd ever imagined. Years passed, and Ethan's life in New York became his own. He and Caleb moved into a bigger apartment, their walls lined with skateboards and photos from their adventures. Ethan enrolled in community college, studying graphic design, his sketches filled with the curves and lines of skate parks. Caleb landed a sponsorship, his name starting to appear in skate magazines. They built a life together, not perfect but real, grounded in the love they'd fought to claim. The past wasn't gone, though. Ethan still carried the weight of his lie, a scar that reminded him how far he'd come. He'd made peace with most of the campers from that summer, even Riley, who'd mellowed after seeing Ethan's growth. But the real challenge was Ohio. Ethan hadn't been home in years, avoiding the confrontation he knew was coming. When his mom called, asking him to visit for Thanksgiving, he felt the old fear creep in. "Bring Caleb," she said, her voice hesitant but kind. It was an olive branch, and Ethan took it. The trip back to Ohio was surreal. The town hadn't changed, same dusty streets, same judgmental stares. Ethan's parents were stiff at first, unsure how to navigate their son's new life. But Caleb's warmth disarmed them, his stories about skating and New York filling the awkward silences. Over dinner, Ethan's dad asked, "You're happy, aren't you?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Happier than I've ever been." It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start, and that was enough. Back in New York, Ethan and Caleb faced new challenges. Caleb's sponsorship meant more travel, and Ethan struggled with the distance. There were fights, moments of doubt, but they always came back to each other. One night, after a rough week, Caleb proposed they start a skate camp of their own. One for everyone, no labels required. A place where kids can just be themselves, Caleb said, his eyes bright. Ethan loved the idea, and they threw themselves into planning, their shared dream a new kind of anchor. The camp opened 2 years later, in the same upstate New York lakefront where they'd met. It was small but vibrant, filled with kids from every background, all chasing the same freedom Ethan had found. On opening day, Ethan stood on the ramp, watching Caleb teach a shy kid how to ollie. The lake sparkled under the sun, and Ethan felt a lump in his throat. This was the life he'd never dared imagine, a life where he was whole, where love wasn't a lie but a truth he lived every day. That evening, as the campers gathered for a bonfire, Ethan and Caleb slipped away to the lake's edge. The sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, just like the image Ethan had carried in his heart since that first summer. He took Caleb's hand, their fingers intertwining, and felt a peace he'd once thought impossible. "I lied to get here," Ethan said softly, his voice steady. "But you made me tell the truth." Caleb smiled, pulling him close. "And you made it worth it." They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the stars came out. The lie that had started it all was a distant memory, replaced by a love that had reshaped Ethan's world. He'd come to skate camp chasing a dream, but he'd found something greater, a truth he could embrace, a life he could call his own, and a love that made every risk worthwhile.